Houston, we have a problem. The Episcopal Church refuses to resettle white Afrikaners, citing moral opposition as the reason. The church said it's terminating a decades-long partnership with the federal government to help refugees arriving in the U.S., citing moral opposition to resettling white Afrikaners from South Africa. Tyrone Bowman, live. According to NPR, let's talk about it. In a striking move that ends a nearly 4 decades old relationship between the federal government and the Episcopal Church, the denomination announced on Monday that it is terminating its partnership with the government to resettle refugees, citing moral opposition to resettling white Afrikaners from South Africa, who have been classified as refugees by President Trump's administration. In a letter sent to members of the church, the Most Reverend Sean W. Rowe, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, said that 2 weeks ago the government, quote, informed Episcopal Migration Ministries that under the terms of our federal grant, we are expected to resettle white Afrikaners from South Africa, whom the U.S. government has classified as refugees, end quote. The request, Rose said, crossed a moral line for the Episcopal Church, which is part of the global Anglican Communion, which boasts among its leaders the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a celebrated and vocal opponent of apartheid in South Africa. Quote, in light of our church's steadfast commitment to racial justice and reconciliation and our historic ties with the Anglican Church of South Africa, we are not able to take this step, close quote. Rowe wrote, quote, accordingly, we have determined that by the end of the federal fiscal year, we will conclude our refugee settlement grant agreement with the U.S. federal government, end quote. Rowe stressed that the white Episcopal Migration Ministries will seek to, quote, wind down all federally funded services by the end of the fiscal year in September, end quote. The denomination will continue to support immigrants and refugees in other ways, such as offering aid to refugees who have already been settled. The announcement came just as flights with Afrikaners were scheduled to arrive at Washington Dulles International Airport outside of Washington, D.C. The first batch of entries after Trump declared via a February executive order that the U.S. would take in, quote, Afrikaners in South Africa, who are victims of unjust racial discrimination, end quote. The South African government has stringently denied allegations of systemic racial animus and has a coalition of white religious leaders in the region that includes many Anglicans. Quote, the stated reason for Trump's actions are claims of victimization, violence, and hateful rhetoric against white people in South Africa, along with legislation providing for the expropriation of land without compensation, end quote. Read the letter from white South African religious leaders, which included among its 4 authors are Anglican priests, quote, as white South Africans in active leadership within the Christian community, representing diverse political and theological perspectives, we unanimously reject these claims, end quote. In addition to ties with Tutu, the Episcopal Church has a long history of advocating against apartheid in South Africa. It first began altering its financial holdings in the region in 1966, and by the mid-1980s, the church vowed to divest from companies doing business in South Africa. Rowe noted his announcement comes as the Trump administration has otherwise all but frozen the refugee program with Afrikaners among the few and possibly only people granted entry as refugees since January. Shortly after he was sworn in, Trump signed an executive order that essentially halted the refugee program and stopped payments to organizations that assist with the refugee resettlement, including, according to one group, payments for work already performed. That change has left refugees, including Christians, fleeing religious persecution without a clear path forward, and has forced the 10 refugee settlement groups, 7 of which are faith-based, to lay off scores of workers while still trying to support refugees who have recently arrived. 4 of the faith groups have since filed 2 separate lawsuits, one of which recently resulted in a ruling that should have restarted the program. However, refugee groups have accused the government, quote, of delaying compliance, end quote, with the court order. A representative for Church World Service, which is among the groups currently suing the administration, said the organization, quote, has agreed to support one family through remote services, but pointed to an additional statement from last week that voiced ongoing frustration with the government's actions, end quote. Quote, we are concerned that the U.S. government has chosen to fast-track the admission of Afrikaners while actively fighting court orders to provide life-saving resettlement to other refugee populations who are in desperate need of resettlement, end quote. Rick Santos, head of Church World Service, said in a statement last week, quote, by resettling this population, the government is demonstrating it still has the capacity to quickly screen, process, and deport refugees to the United States. It's time for the administration to honor our nation's commitment to the thousands of refugee families it abandoned with its cruel and illegal executive order, end quote. Matthew Surens, Vice President of Advocacy and Policy of World Relief, an evangelical Christian group that helps resettle refugees, said in an email that his group anticipates serving a small number of the arrivals who qualify for Office of Refugee Settlement funded services. But he said the situation is complicated by the reality that the government is not bringing them to the U.S. through the traditional State Department initial resettlement process, where World Relief has historically been one of the 10 private agencies that implement this public-private partnership because that process remains suspended, end quote. What do you think about it? What are your thoughts? I'd like to hear from the people who watch this program. He added, our primary response to this situation is to continue to urge the administration to resume that initial resettlement process from a broad range of individuals who have fled persecution on account of their faith, political opinion, race, or other reasons outlined under U.S. law, and to highlight the support for doing so from the evangelical Christians who are World Relief's core base of support, including some very conservative evangelicals who see refugee settlement as a vital tool to protect those denied religious freedom from abroad. Quote, close quote. Good luck. Never surrender. Never quit.